Chapter 17. Outcomes, Intention, and Trust in Motion. 17.1. When Outcomes Become Identity. From the standpoint of the ego, outcomes feel essential, but not always in the way popular culture suggests. Outcomes are not only used to validate success or justify ambition, they are used to stabilize whatever story about the self has been adopted, inherited, or imposed. Sometimes that story aims upward, toward achievement, recognition, or mastery. At other times, it aims downward, toward limitation, inadequacy, or quiet resignation. In both cases, outcomes are recruited as evidence. For some, success reassures the ego that its narrative is coherent and progressing. For others, failure confirms a long-held belief. This is who I am. This is how it always goes. In either direction, outcomes carry emotional weight far beyond their practical significance. They are not merely results. They are interpreted as proof about worth, capacity, belonging, and one's place in the world. Seen clearly, this attachment is not vanity, ambition, or self-importance. It is structural. The ego organizes experience through time-bound cause and effect, and then overlays that structure with identity. If I try and succeed, I am competent. If I try and fail, I am deficient. If I don't try at all, I am safe from further confirmation. Over time, identity fuses not only with expectation, but with repetition. Plans become proofs. Outcomes, positive or negative, become reinforcements of the story already being told. This is why outcomes provoke such strong reactions, even when, on the surface, they seem minor. They are rarely about the event itself. They are about whether the event supports or threatens the ego's sense of coherence. When outcomes align with the story, whether that story is flattering or self-critical, the ego relaxes. When they do not, anxiety, frustration, shame, or despair follow. Not because reality has failed, but because the narrative has been disrupted. Crucially, the ego's storyline is not always self-chosen. Many identities are inherited before reflection is possible. Family roles, cultural expectations, early labeling, illness narratives, social marginalization, or repeated relational injury can all crystallize into conclusions about who one is allowed to be. I'm the difficult one. I'm the sick one. I'm not smart. I don't belong. In these cases, outcomes are not pursued to prove worth, but endured, or even unconsciously engineered, to confirm it. From the perspective of the soul, outcomes occupy a very different role. They are not confirmations of identity, positive or negative, nor final verdicts on success or failure. They are experiences, instructive, catalytic, sometimes joyful, sometimes painful, but never definitive. The soul is not attempting to secure a storyline, nor to disprove one. It is participating in a field of learning, where growth arises through interactions, contrast, and response, rather than through narrative consistency. This difference in orientation explains why outcome fixation produces strain, regardless of whether one's story is ambitious or self-limiting. When our awareness is identified with the ego's storyline, uncertainty becomes intolerable. The future must either be controlled or avoided. Possibility feels dangerous. Change threatens identity rather than expanding it. Life is approached as a test to pass, fail, or endure, rather than a process to inhabit and a way toward becoming soulful. This is not a call to abandon planning, responsibility, or intention. Those are necessary functions of incarnation. Bills must be paid. Children must be raised. Bodies must be cared for. Discernment remains essential. What shifts is not whether we act, but where authorship and alignment are controlled while interacting, whether outcomes are being used to confirm a story about who we are, or simply to inform how we respond. When the practices of Chapter 13, restraining judgment and comparison in ourselves and others, are engaged consistently, something deeper than emotional regulation begins to occur. Our egoic identity itself starts to loosen. The ego's storyline, which once required reinforcement through our place on the pecking order, our possessions, and our image to others, no longer holds exclusive authorship. This matters because many of the outcomes we once felt compelled to secure were not neutral goals. They were identity subsidies. Goods, homes, job titles, peer recognition, and how others looked upon us often functioned as external confirmations of a self-image the ego needed to maintain. These objectives were not chosen freely. They were inherited, absorbed, or constructed through comparison, shaped by family narratives, cultural expectations, peer validation, or quiet fear of inadequacy. As judgment and comparison are recognized and restrained, the emotional fuel that sustained these objectives begins to drain away. Not through renunciation and not through moral effort, but through irrelevance. What once felt urgent begins to feel optional. What once promised fulfillment or made us feel safe begins to feel oddly flat. The things and people that once seemed necessary to surround ourselves with to support our identity lose their appeal. This does not mean ambition disappears, nor does it mean material comfort is rejected. It means that objectives of any kind are no longer tasked with proving identity. Plans are no longer required to defend worth. Goals begin to reorganize themselves around different values, not because we decide to be more virtuous, but because we have become aligned toward virtue. When awareness is oriented toward love, unity, and participation rather than fear, separation, and rivalry, objectives naturally evolve. Meaning is no longer extracted from comparison. Success is no longer measured primarily by how one appears relative to others. The question subtly changes from "what do I need to become?" to "how do I wish to participate?" In this way, outcome freedom operates on two levels at once. It loosens our attachment to specific results, allowing life to unfold without constant negotiation with expectation, and it reshapes the results we seek in the first place. Plans become more congruent with orientation. Effort becomes less defensive. Direction remains, but the emotional stakes soften. This is why outcome freedom cannot be practiced effectively in isolation. It is the downstream effect of identity no longer being constructed through judgment and comparison. When the ego is no longer required to author the self, the future is no longer required to validate it. Many spiritual traditions have pointed to this distinction without always naming it explicitly. Some describe life as a river rather than a destination. One may paddle, steer, and respond, but attempting to control the current exhausts the traveler. Others speak of probable realities rather than fixed outcomes, emphasizing that consciousness often selects among unfolding possibilities rather than marching toward a single predetermined end. In both frameworks, intention matters deeply. Identity fixation does not. Direction is honored. Rigidity is released. From this orientation, going with the flow does not mean passivity or denial of responsibility. It means cooperation without self-definition. One still sets aims, makes choices, and responds to conditions, but without demanding that reality validate or invalidate the self in order for meaning to be preserved. Actual outcomes are allowed to inform, not define. This distinction becomes especially important when plans fail, detour, or dissolve entirely, or when they succeed yet fail to deliver the promised sense of arrival. When identity is fused to outcome, disruption feels personal. It can trigger shame, resentment, or the sense that life itself has betrayed us. When identity rests instead in alignment with love, unity, and participation, disruption becomes intelligible without becoming punitive. Importantly, this does not require spiritualizing disappointment or pretending loss does not hurt. Grief, frustration, and fear still arise. What changes is that these experiences are no longer interpreted as evidence of failure, defect, or cosmic judgment. There is no tribunal evaluating performance. There is only learning in motion. The question shifts from, "Why didn't this work?" or "What does this say about me?" to "What is being revealed? What lesson is presenting itself to me now?" When awareness begins to loosen ego's grip on outcomes as identity markers, whether those markers promise triumph or confirm limitation, something unexpected happens. Life often becomes simpler. Much of the pressure to perform, prove, or defend evaporates. Energy once spent maintaining a story, positive or negative, is freed for responsiveness. Goals may remain. Circumstances may remain challenging, but the emotional weight carried by outcomes lightens. This is why so many traditions speak of reward, though not in the transactional sense often assumed. They were not pointing to celestial prizes or deferred compensation. They were pointing to a qualitatively different way of inhabiting the same world. The reward is immediacy, less resistance to what is, less internal division, less self-generated suffering. One steps off the rat race of comparison and the Ferris wheel of perpetual grasping, not by rejecting life, but by seeing through the stories that once governed what we sought. From this place, outcomes still matter, but they matter appropriately. They guide discernment. They inform adjustment. They refine intention. But they no longer determine worth. This reorientation sets the stage for practice. Understanding the nature of outcome attachment, whether aspirational or limiting, is necessary, but insufficient. The real work lies in learning how to act fully, plan responsibly, and respond intelligently without surrendering authorship to expectation or identity. That is the task we now turn toward. 17.2. Practicing outcome freedom in daily life. Understanding our relationship to outcomes is only the beginning. The real work unfolds in the midst of ordinary days, while planning, choosing, striving, failing, succeeding, and adjusting. Outcome freedom is not a philosophical stance adopted once and then retained. It is a practice, repeatedly remembered and repeatedly lost, especially when stakes feel high. In daily life, outcomes matter. Decisions have consequences. Actions shape circumstances. Responsibility does not disappear simply because awareness expands. The shift introduced by this work is not whether we engage with outcomes, but how we hold them internally. At the level of practice, outcome freedom begins with a simple distinction. Intention belongs to us. Results do not. Intention reflects orientation toward honesty, care, responsibility, creativity, or service. Outcomes emerge from a far larger field: timing, other people's choices, unseen variables, and trajectories that extend beyond a single lifetime. Confusing the two places unbearable pressure on the self. Early in practice, this confusion shows up as subtle tension. Plans feel charged. Goals feel heavy. There is an urgency beneath action that says, "This must work," or "This has to mean something about me." When awareness notices this tightening, the work is not to abandon the plan, but to loosen identification with its success. A helpful question in these moments is not, "Will this work?" but "Am I acting from alignment or from fear?" The same action, sending an email, setting a boundary, pursuing a goal, can arise from either place. When fear drives action, outcomes become tests of worth. When alignment drives action, outcomes become information. This distinction becomes clearest when things do not go as planned. Disappointment is inevitable. Plans fail. Relationships end. Efforts go unnoticed. Health declines. Opportunities dissolve. From the ego's perspective, these moments feel catastrophic. Not necessarily because of the loss itself, but because the storyline collapses. This wasn't supposed to happen. This ruins everything. Now, what does this say about me? From within practice, disappointment is still felt, sometimes deeply, but it is not interpreted as punishment or error. The nervous system may grieve, contract, or protest. That is human. What changes is that awareness does not immediately construct meaning around the pain. The experience is allowed to be what it is before being assigned a verdict. This pause matters. It is here that outcome freedom becomes real. Instead of asking, "Why did this fail?" the practitioner learns to ask, "What is being asked of me now?" Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. What adjustment is required? What is still intact? What capacity is being strengthened? What attachment is being exposed? Importantly, this does not mean assuming that every disappointment is meant to be in a comforting or redemptive way. Some outcomes hurt because they hurt. Some losses remain losses. The work is not to explain them away, but to meet them with discernment, without adding unnecessary suffering by binding identity to what has occurred. Success, too, requires practice. When outcomes align with intention, the ego is quick to claim authorship. Pride arises. Identity swells. Comparison returns quietly through the side door. I did this. I'm ahead. I'm finally becoming who I should be. Without awareness, success becomes just as binding as failure. Another hook into the storyline. Practicing outcome freedom here means allowing success to be enjoyed without being used. Gratitude replaces self-congratulation. Satisfaction replaces inflation. One acknowledges effort, luck, support, and timing together, rather than collapsing everything into personal merit. Success becomes something experienced, not something owned. Over time, this changes how goals themselves are held. Goals are no longer demands placed on the future to justify the present. They become directions of movement rather than destinations that must be reached for life to make sense. One still plans. One still commits. One still works. But the emotional demand placed on results softens. This is what going with the flow actually means in practice. It does not mean drifting without intention. It means moving with responsiveness rather than insistence. Steering when steering is possible. Yielding when yielding is required. Acting fully without demanding control over what cannot be controlled. This way of living often feels counterintuitive at first, especially in cultures that equate worth with productivity and success with virtue. It can feel irresponsible to loosen the grip on outcomes. In practice, the opposite is true. When fear-based attachment drops away, discernment improves. Decisions become cleaner. Energy is no longer wasted resisting reality. Action becomes more effective precisely because it is less burdened. Gradually, something deeper shifts. Life begins to feel less like a performance and more like participation. Experiences, pleasant and unpleasant alike, are recognized as part of a much larger arc of learning. The soul's curriculum is not evaluated by comfort, but by coherence. What matters is not whether events unfold as hoped, but whether awareness remains oriented toward love, unity, and truth as they do. This does not eliminate difficulty. It changes relationship to it. Over time, the practitioner discovers that freedom from outcome fixation does not diminish engagement with life. It intensifies it. When identity is no longer on the line, one can risk more honestly, love more freely, and respond more accurately. The future loosens its grip. The present becomes inhabitable. This is not resignation. It is trust in motion. 17.3. Practicing outcome freedom in lived circumstances. Outcome freedom is tested not in abstraction, but in contact with circumstances that do not yield to effort, intention, or optimism. It is one thing to loosen identification with goals when alternatives remain open. It is another when life constrains you, when paths close, options disappear, effort no longer changes outcomes, and something irreversible comes into view. This is where practice becomes real. Certain experiences confront the ego with limits it cannot negotiate away. Grief that does not resolve on schedule. illness that does not improve with compliance, loss of status that cannot be repaired, relationships that end despite sincere effort, roles that collapse without replacement. In these moments, the ego's storyline, whether ambitious or self-protective, loses traction. The future it was organizing toward is no longer available, and the self it was defending feels exposed. From the ego's perspective, these moments are existential threats. Not only has something gone wrong, but meaning itself seems endangered. If I am no longer productive, admired, healthy, needed, or progressing, who am I now? What does this say about me? The pull to extract identity from outcome intensifies precisely when outcomes fail. Outcome freedom in this context does not mean emotional detachment. Grief still hurts, fear still rises, anger still flashes, the body reacts, the nervous system contracts. These responses are not signs of misalignment, they are signs of being human. The practice is not to eliminate them, but to prevent them from being recruited into a verdict about the self. Consider grief. When someone we love dies, the loss is not symbolic, it is real. No reframing can erase absence. The ego often responds by asking questions it cannot answer. Why did this happen? What should I have done differently? How do I move on? Beneath these questions is a deeper fear. This pain will define me. This loss will be who I am now. Practicing outcome freedom here does not require acceptance in advance. It does not require peace. It does not require meaning. It requires restraint. The restraint is simple but profound, not allowing grief to harden into identity. One does not say, "This pain means my life is broken," or "I will never be whole again." One allows sorrow to move without letting it dictate the story of what one is. Illness presents a different challenge. Especially in cultures that equate worth with function, illness can feel like a personal failure. The body becomes unpredictable. Plans are interrupted. Identity built around competence, vitality, or independence begins to erode. The ego searches for explanation. Did I cause this? Am I weak? Am I falling behind? From the perspective of practice, illness is not treated as a spiritual lesson to be appreciated, nor as an enemy to be defeated at all costs. It is treated as an experience occurring within a much larger arc of being, one that extends beyond a single lifetime, a single body, or a single role. The body is honored for what it can do, cared for where it cannot, and not asked to justify the self's worth. Status loss, whether professional, social, or relational, can be just as destabilizing. Titles disappear, recognition fades, authority dissolves. For those whose identity has been organized around visibility or achievement, this can feel like annihilation. The ego interprets the loss as exposure. Now everyone will see who I really am. Here, outcome freedom takes the form of remembering what was never actually at stake. Visibility was never identity. Function was never essence. Respect earned through comparison was always provisional. When these structures fall away, what remains is not deficiency, but contact, with oneself, with others, with life as it is, rather than as it appeared. In all of these circumstances, the temptation is the same: to use the outcome, loss, illness, failure, or diminishment, as evidence. Evidence that one has failed, been punished, fallen behind, or misunderstood the rules of life. This is where the practice must be precise. Outcome freedom does not say, "This is good." It does not say, "This is meant to be." It does not say, "I should be grateful for this." It says only this: this experience is not who I am. This distinction preserves dignity without denying reality. It allows suffering without turning suffering into identity. It allows response without collapsing into narrative. The reincarnational framework you have already established becomes especially stabilizing here. When awareness remembers that this incarnated self is one expression within a vast continuum of experience, one lifetime among many, one role among countless others, then no single outcome can bear the weight of total meaning. This does not trivialize pain. It contextualizes it. From this vantage point, even the most disruptive experiences can be met without surrendering authorship. One may grieve deeply and still remain oriented toward love. One may be ill and still participate fully in relationship. One may lose status and still act with integrity and care. The soul does not measure progress by comfort or visibility. It measures coherence. This is also where acceptance of outcomes becomes distinguishable from resignation. Resignation withdraws. It collapses engagement. It says, "Nothing matters now." Acceptance remains present. It says, "This is what is here. How shall I respond?" Practicing outcome freedom in lived circumstances means continuing to act responsibly without demanding resolution. It means making decisions without certainty. It means allowing the future to remain open, even when it looks nothing like what was planned. It means trusting that learning continues even when progress cannot be charted. Over time, this produces a quiet confidence that does not depend on circumstances improving. The practitioner learns, through repeated contact, that identity survives disappointment, loss, and disruption intact. Not because nothing was lost, but because what is essential was never tied to outcomes in the first place. This does not eliminate pain. It changes its role. Pain becomes something that moves through awareness rather than something that defines it. Experience becomes something that informs rather than condemns. Life becomes something participated in rather than negotiated with. And slowly, often without fanfare, trust replaces insistence. Not blind trust and not passive trust, but trust in motion. Trust that one can meet what arises without losing oneself. Trust that alignment does not require control. Trust that meaning does not collapse when plans do. This is the deeper freedom outcome practice offers. Not immunity from difficulty, but freedom from the belief that difficulty determines who we are. With this capacity in place, experience, whatever its shape, can be gathered rather than resisted. That gathering is what integration truly means, and it is to that work that we now turn, and it prepares the ground for what comes next, integration. Not as an end point, but as a way of gathering experience, success and failure alike, back into a coherent, lived understanding of who we are and why we are here.